What's up, everybody? Rob here. So there are many reasons for a soldier to go to war. It could be a sense of patriotism, they might be longing for some sort of adventure, or sometimes they were just plainly conscripted. However, one of the most popular reasons to go into a battle zone where you are likely to get your head caved in is the possibility of earning cold, hard cash. And during the Middle Ages, one of the most effective ways to acquire said cash was through ransoms. So here we go, a quick look at ransom in medieval warfare. So, ransoming people in warfare is nothing new. This was actually a practice that was done as far back as the ancient world, but it really kind of fell out of favor during the medieval period, or the early medieval period. But starting around the 11th century, ransoming as a concept took off again, and it reached its peak between the 12th century and the 15th century, fundamentally altering the nature of warfare during that era. Okay, so the way ransoming works is actually pretty simple. If somebody's captured on a battlefield, that person would be taken prisoner. In order to be released, a certain amount of money would be paid. Once this payment was given, that person would then be released. It's a very simple concept, very straightforward. Now, actually, the fact that this was so incredibly common made recruitment much, much easier. Generally speaking, people don't want to die, and they also want to get rich. So, if the possibility of ransoming is on the table, they are actually much less likely to be killed, and they know they're less likely to be killed because, well, they represent a value to their captor. They're actually worth more alive than dead. So they're actually less likely to just be outright killed. And also, if they are lucky enough to capture somebody, especially somebody who is extremely wealthy, well, they can get a huge chunk of cash along the way. Now, this was not limited to the battlefield. Actually, at tournaments, at least earlier in the Middle Ages, a defeated enemy would have to turn over his armor and his horse and weapons and other gear to his victor. For example, the greatest of knights, William Marshall, made an absolute fortune this way, rising up from a relatively poor knight to probably the most famous and wealthy knight in the kingdom, and possibly the most famous in history. And in some cases, some knights were like professional athletes, traveling around the tournament circuit throughout Europe, making an absolute fortune in these styles of competitions. However, most ransoms came from the battlefield. Well, how did that work? Okay, so here's what happens. You go on a battlefield and you're not that good, okay? The enemy, they're just better than you and everything, and you get your face kicked in. But you're still alive. So what you do is you beg for mercy because, well, that's what you do. You kind of have to surrender. Now, the guy who just beat you has complete control over your life, and this is, of course, provided he just doesn't outright kill you, which he could do. Now, this is a time before the Geneva Convention, and according to the rules and customs of war, he is well within his rights to just, bash your head in with a mace or slit your throat or do pretty much whatever he wants to you. It was actually basically totally acceptable. Now, let's just say he's not completely consumed with battle lust, and he thinks you might be more valuable alive than dead. So he takes you prisoner. Okay, so now what? So what would happen is the captor would determine the value of his prisoner. You'd have a conversation with this guy, and this would not be a fixed amount, but rather would be based upon how much the captive could potentially pay. Or more specifically, how much he could convince his captor he could pay. So, for example, a rich peasant, for example, somebody who's not of the nobility, but say he has a relative, oh, my dad's a rich merchant, yeah, he's super wealthy, and you can somehow convince him that this is the case, he actually would be worth more than a poor knight. Social standing really does not have anything to do with it directly. However, this is the Middle Ages, and so generally speaking, people higher in social rank were more wealthy, which means they were actually more valuable. And because the lower ranks were less valuable, they were less likely to be taken prisoner. Now, this does not, of course, mean that lower ranks were not ransomed or were not taken prisoner. It just means less likely the case, especially if you're, say, a peasant, and the guy who captures you or, knocks you out, knocks you over, is a knight, a very wealthy knight, and you're just some, peasant spearman. He'll just bash your head in, because honestly, look, he's already, to put it in modern day terms, a multimillionaire. You're living off minimum wage. Like, what's he gonna? You're gonna give him like $50? It's not worth it. He'll just cave your skull in. It's easier that way. Now, obviously, ransoms would not be paid on the spot because nobody actually walks onto a battlefield with that kind of cash. So the prisoner would be taken into custody until the ransom is negotiated, usually with family members and other messengers as intermediaries, and this process can take months, maybe even years. Now, during this time, it was incumbent upon the captor to provide accommodations for his prisoner, and of course, this was subject to rank, and somebody higher up in the food chain would be treated much better than somebody who was much lower. This meant, unfortunately, that lower classes who couldn't convince anyone of their value were more likely to just be slaughtered rather than taken captured. Now, the amount somebody could get from ransoms was actually based on how much a man could potentially pay, which is part of the negotiation process. It's not like there was a chart or anything or any sort of fixed amount. It was an actual negotiation, which could take a fairly long time. And how good are your negotiating skills? Well, that's how much it could cost. Now, of course, there was no point in setting the ransom too high because, yes, you could potentially get that money, but if the guy couldn't actually pay it, well, it kind of defeats the purpose, and, well, what are you wasting your time on? Now, there are exceptions to this. Some cases, the ransom would be set very high deliberately for political reasons. I'll get more onto that in a bit. Now, while held captive, the prisoner can be treated in any number of conditions, again, mostly dependent on his social rank. Some men, especially the lower classes, could potentially be held in squalor or in one-room cells packed together, basically, dungeons, chained to the walls, that sort of stuff. While the upper classes could be held in very comfortable conditions, in some cases being treated almost as part of the household of his captor, until his ransom was repaid and he was released. In some cases, prisoners would even be released on sort of a parole system in order to help facilitate their ransom. For example, Bertrand du Guesclin, who was a French commander in the 100 Years' War, he would later on become the Constable of France, would be released from captivity by Edward the Black Prince after his capture at the Battle of Nahara in order to help raise his ransom. Because of honor and chivalry, and honestly just concern over their reputation, generally speaking, these men would not turn back on their promise to pay the ransom even after being released on this parole. They would actually, go and help facilitate the raise of the ransom and actually raise the money for their ransom payments. So the question becomes, how much can you make if demanding ransom? And more importantly, if you're on the wrong side of it, how much money are you going to have to pay? Well, like I said, it mostly depends on your negotiating skills as well as your social rank and honestly just the mood of your captor. As one goes up the food chain in the feudal hierarchy, the numbers can increase dramatically. After the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, one archer by the name of William Callow captured a knight and earned 100 pounds for his trouble. Now, if you want to do the math, an archer during that era would make around 6 pence per day. And in the Old English monetary system, 12 pence is equal to 1 shilling, and 20 shillings is equal to 1 pound. So if you do my math here, which I'm positive is wrong because I suck at math, but in any case, that's 13.3 years of wages he earned in a single battle. Now, if you want to put that into modern terms, which I'm kind of hesitant to do because money works differently, economies work differently now than it did back at the time, but for the fun of it, here in the United States, the median household income is $68,000 per year. And you multiply that by 13.3 years, it comes out to $904,000, which is a pretty good amount of money for, an average person there. Now, when major nobles captured, the numbers get even higher. For example, the Black Prince demanded a ransom of 100,000 francs for the release of Bertrand du Guesclin. Now, this was a sum that Guesclin could not possibly hope to raise on his own, and he had to turn to the King of France to help raise his funds, which the King of France, Charles V, actually did. The reason why he did this is because he was indispensable as a commander, and honestly, it was considered that the ransom would be worth it. And that is also why he was released on parole to help facilitate this transfer. Now, interestingly enough, this actually further emphasized the relationship between the nobility and the king and helped reinforce the feudal order. It's really hard to betray or undermine somebody who paid for your release. So, if anything, it just kind of ensures the loyalty of a subordinate. Basically, I paid for your release. You're not going to undermine, I need this policy done. I need you to do X, Y, and Z. Just remember, You used to be rotting in an English prison. By rotting, I mean he was treated very well, but you know what I mean. You were there, prisoner of the English. You're released because of me. It's kind of hard to betray that guy, And if you think that that was a lot of money, well, just imagine how it goes when a king gets captured. And this is usually measured in terms of gross domestic product. To give you just a couple examples, you have Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. He was captured by the Duke of Austria, turned over to the Holy Roman Empire, Holy Roman Emperor, and he was ransomed for 150,000 marks, which is right about twice the yearly income of the English crown during that era. King John II of France was captured at the Battle of Crécy, and his ransom was set for 3 million crowns, which is about 2 to 3 years of revenue for the French throne during that era. So we're talking GDP levels of, again, putting it into modern terms, we're talking trillions of dollars. Now, the ransoms were set high, very deliberate. Now, of course, a king is going to be worth a ton of money, obviously, but they were set so absurdly high because sometimes it's not about the money. Sometimes it really is about sending a message. Now, for example, with the capture of King John II, this was the height of the 100 Years' War. So by having the King of France in English custody, this gave the English a tremendous amount of leverage in negotiations. And actually, the ransom was set so high that they could actually keep this leverage. If it was set too low, the French government, well, he is the government, he is the king, but, the French people, the French nation, the other nobles, whatever, the treasury, however you want to define it, they would have simply, that's all you want? You want like, $50 and a ham sandwich? Okay, yeah, sure. They'd hand over the money and release them. By keeping it so absurdly high, like several years worth of revenue, basically when your king is a prisoner of the enemy, that enemy has a tremendous amount of leverage over you, which was used in negotiation efforts. Now, King John was actually imprisoned and spent 4 years in England, and he was actually treated like a king while he was there. He was actually treated very well, had more or less free reign of the country. He was under guard, of course, but he can pretty much wander around, do whatever he wanted, led a pretty good life there. And he was eventually released so he could help raise the ransom, very similar to the parole that I talked about earlier. And also included in this ransom would include territorial concessions and other concessions that helped the English war effort. Now, an interesting tidbit about this particular instance shows the nature of chivalry during this era. His son Louis would be held as hostage in Calais while he was released, a guarantee on his promise. Basically, he was held a hostage just to make sure you don't go back on your word. And during the course of this time, Louis actually escaped. And because of this, John was absolutely heartbroken at the what he considered to be a betrayal and voluntarily returned to English captivity, citing his quote, end quote, good faith and honor. Now, this brings me to another point here. Because chivalry and honor were so strong, oftentimes knights would be allowed to set their own ransoms. This was particularly the case by captured Frenchmen during the 100 Years' War. And this was just a way for them to affirm their own status. And it was something the English took full advantage of. So when captured, the French knights and nobles would insist their ransoms would actually be much higher in order to demonstrate their own importance. It was felt that too small of a ransom would reflect badly on their character and their rank in society, and would oftentimes just financially ruin themselves for the sake of their honor. And this kind of reminds me of when Julius Caesar was captured by Cilician pirates, and they set his ransom, and he actually complained that the ransom was far too low. Similar idea there. Just if you set the ransom too low, they might actually get insulted. So they'll actually bankrupt themselves just to prove how high up the social order they are. Make of that whatever you will. And also, ransoms do not necessarily have to be in the form of money, but sometimes in the form of people. So prisoner exchanges did occur as well. Now, during the anarchy in England, for example, King Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln and held in custody by Queen Matilda. And Matilda was on top of things until her most valuable supporter, Robert of Gloucester, was also captured, and the two were exchanged for one another. So while money is the primary factor, there are also political and other factors to be considered as well. Now, the notion of ransom, or the idea of ransom, was not always followed. Remember, this was more of a custom, not a hard written rule. Famously, after the Battle of Agincourt, Henry V ordered the execution of many French prisoners, not all of them, but many of them, in order to avoid them fighting against the English later on. The English army was still very small. They won an absolute miracle at Agincourt. You know what happened at Agincourt. They won an absolute miracle there. But there was fear that there would be another French army coming up, and we might not be able to beat these guys, and we can't spare men to guard a bunch of prisoners. So, yeah, might as well just execute them, lest during the course of the battle they rise up, take up arms, and now we have prisoners going around our rear areas, causing all kinds of havoc there. So they were executed, much to the consternation of much of the nobles. The archers were more than happy to do it, though. Make of that whatever you will. And during the Wars of the Roses, actually the opposite happened from what would be considered normal conventions. So commoners would be spared and sometimes ransomed, and sometimes they would just be plain old released without any sort of ransom occurring at all. And the nobility would simply be executed or just flat out killed on the battlefield. Like, no prisoners would be taken for nobles. So basically, if you were noble, you just wouldn't even be taken prisoner at all. And the reasoning behind this is that this was, in fact, a civil war. Killing commoners equals killing your own people, and something that men on both sides, the leaders on both sides, were hesitant to do. They wanted to, say, look, I'm the rightful king. I don't want to slaughter my own people. Look, you're commoners. You just were dragged into this by your social betters. But, it's not your fault. I'm the good king. Please, support me. I'm releasing you, letting you go. The guy that sent you to this battle, that noble, he's dead. Oh yeah, because that's obviously a rival power, and honestly, you need to destroy rebels lest they rebel against you in the future. So yes, they did lose out on a lot of ransom money, but at the same time, political expediency trumped all. There are also cases of individuals who simply would not be taken prisoner or could not be allowed to be ransomed if they were captured. For example, the knightly orders, such as the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights, amongst others. There were actually provisions in the order's rules that stated that they will not be ransomed if captured, and they were actually expected to die on the battlefield as martyrs for Christ. So, because of this, during the times of the Crusades, many Saracen leaders, including Saladin, who generally was a fairly merciful person, he did execute people, he wasn't as merciful as pop culture tends to make him out, but he understood the concept. He would oftentimes just execute them outright if they were captured because, well, we're not getting any money out of them, and they're actually a very formidable fighting force as well. So we're not going to release them, so just execute them. It was just easier that way. So there you go. So some cases you just simply were not eligible to be ransomed to begin with. And of course, there is the issue of simple bloodlust. And sometimes a surrendering soldier would simply be executed in the heat of the moment, regardless of any financial gain he may represent. Remember, this is in fact a battlefield. People have their adrenaline going. They got their blood up. Next thing you know, you're fighting somebody, his skull gets crushed in, and, well, he's dead now. He might have been worth, in equivalent today's terms, millions upon millions of dollars, but he's dead and dying in a heap now. So, okay, well, there you go. There's a battlefield, there's a lot of sharp, pointy things, a lot of blunt, heavy things swinging at people's faces. Stuff happens, no matter how careful you try to be. So, there you are, just real quick, a look at medieval ransom. I hope you found this video interesting and entertaining. Please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos will be coming out whenever I get around to it. Have a good day. Or don't have a good day. You're an adult. Have any kind of day you want. See you later.